you wanted me to screen share, I haven't done that on Zoom. I'm happy to do it. I also brought copies. So whichever way you prefer.
Don't need the screen share. I think we've all got it. And if you want to
Okay.
pass out hard copies, that would be fine.
Yeah, sure. I know it's the old school, but I get sick of staring at screens all the time.
Yeah.
There's 12, I think, if Laura, if you'd like one too. So I guess that needs this then, right? Sorry. Okay.
Okay, well, I think we're good.
Yeah. Should we start?
Yeah.
So did you already go over this with Michael Grady then yesterday? Okay, I wasn't certain of that, but so.
Yeah, he walked us through the language and sorry, I should have you introduce yourself for the record, Steve, before.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Steve Collier. I'm General Counsel at the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so we did have a walkthrough with Ledge Council on the language. And we tried to keep our questions to the, what the language implied rather than the reasons for the language, since he wasn't necessarily, privy to that and hadn't come up with the language himself. So,
Right.
So I'm sure there'll be questions about the intent or what we're trying to do.
Sure. So would you like me to start by giving an overview of
I
each?
think that would be great. Yeah.
Okay. And if I can just preface it with, I'm the lawyer for the agency. I did help craft this language. I did work with the people in our agency who do this. I'm not the expert in a lot of these areas. All of our experts who work with these programs every day are more than happy to come in and talk to all of you about exactly why. I think I have a good understanding, but if you get into some of the detailed questions about who does exactly what, I probably will have to defer to our experts. But I would like to just start by saying how important this process is to us. And we have done this for years, as I understand it, and certainly for the 3 years that I'm here. But every year we propose things that we believe need updating. So oftentimes they're technical changes and quite minor. Sometimes they're more substantive. But anyone who's read the law, interpreted the law, and applied the law knows how difficult it is to do, sometimes under the best of circumstances. So this process of all of our divisions and all of our employees know that we regularly go through this process with all of you. It's really, really helpful. It does keep our language more current. It does make it more applicable. It does make it clearer to citizens, which is really what it's all about in the end. So we really appreciate this process. It's very helpful for us. And I think it also helps all of you understand a little bit more of what we do, because there's such a wide range that when you start tapping into these narrow little microcosms, you get a little bit better a sense of the scope of all of it. But this process, we're just very appreciative for this process because it is incredibly helpful to us to make sure that we can do our work as well as possible. So the first one is about the stipend to agricultural fairs and field days. This is a little bit of a mystery exactly how this all unfolded, but the reason for this language is that the fair stipend program used to be based on a racing lottery system. Essentially, there used to be racing in the state, and there was something called a state stipend fund that was set up, and the proceeds, as I understand it, came from those races, so horse racing, and I think either other kinds of racing. Some of that, the proceeds were diverted to a state stipend fund, which was then appropriated to us to distribute to fairs and field days. So that old state statute was in Title 31. It was Section 617. It was enacted in 1989. We wrote a rule based on the rulemaking authority that the legislature gave us in 1989 and 1991, and that statute was later repealed in 1997. So we have been appropriating grants based on our rule, which is still in the rules, from 1991 that was based on that statute that was repealed. So the way that works is we only have rulemaking authority to write rules for the authority that the legislature gives us. So I'm not very comfortable that we've been operating on a rule that no longer has a statutory predicate. I'm assuming that maybe when that statute was repealed, the legislature may have done something in the big bill or may have done something to preserve that relationship or referenced it in the grant funding, but somewhere along the way, there's no more clear direction from the legislature about how you want us to allocate those funds. So even though this first section is quite lengthy, its only purpose is to try to memorialize in law what we've been doing for decades. And it's written a little bit differently than it might be if we were thinking about doing this from scratch. But the reality is there's about 14 fairs and field days, I think, that are registered with us. And there's this, the way that it's been working is you have to be open for at least 3 days a year to be an eligible fair. There's one exception for a fair that's been receiving funds for a long time that's only open for 2 days. So as we understand it, all the fairs are happy with the process. The legislature seems to be happy with the process. So all we tried to do was codify the existing process. It's possible that you all may think that there are better ways to do it, and we're totally open to those. We were just trying to sort of solidify what's there now. And the way it works right now is essentially we look at 4 different factors. So you have to the whole point is to promote agriculture and food producers. So fairs and field days have to have competitive exhibits so that people who produce food, farmers, or can actually go to the fairs, showcase what they do, compete for prize money. So that's kind of the underlying concept of it. So you have to be an agricultural fair that does that. And what we do is each fair every year, provided that you all appropriate money, is we look at the attendance for the fair. So, total attendance for the fair. We look at the premiums that they offer for those competitive exhibits. We look at the amount that each fair spends on their general operating expenses, and we look at what they do to improve their infrastructure. So there's basically those 4 categories. We put all of the applicants into a pool, and then we determine each fair's respective percentage of that, and then we award on a proportionate share. So try to make that a little simpler, if we have one fair who say they have 5% of the attendance and they have 15% of the premiums, so that's 10% total, right? 5 and 15% of those 2 different categories, you have 10%. The other 2 things are general operating expenses and also your infrastructure improvements. So let's say they have 7.5% and 12.5%, just to make the math easy. So again, it's 10%. So when we look at all 4 of those categories, if that fair has 10% of the total of those 4 things, we would give them 10% of the funds that you allocated to all fairs. So we do it based on those 4 figures. That doesn't have to be how it's done. It's been how it's done. There's some consistency there that fairs kind of know what to expect. And they know that if they increase attendance, they'll get a little bit more. If they lose attendance, they'll get a little bit less. If they spend more on premiums, they're entitled to a bigger share. So that's how it's set up now. We honored that system. There's also a 10% cap on the total awares, total that any single fair can get. And that's so that a fair like Champlain Valley, which is obviously a great fair, very important, but it would basically take all the funds or a huge percentage of the fund if there wasn't that cap. So the idea is to make sure that all of the smaller fairs can benefit while still giving something to all the fairs. Now, if there were fewer than 10 applicants, so if only 8 fairs applied, then that 10% cap would no longer apply. But I don't believe we've ever had that situation. So that is the system. There's a lot of pages here that talk about that system, but that's what it is. And we're, like I said, we're totally open to improvements. It's just that everyone seems to like the system the way it is. So we decided to start, at least we ought to memorialize what exists.
And when you say everyone, you mean the participating fairs and field days?
The fairs, our agency is familiar with implementing it. The legislature has been appropriating funds consistently to it without any request for changes. So it's just a process that seems to be working for the constituents that utilize it.
Maybe a couple of questions, Representative Rice?
Yeah, I just want to be clear because yesterday hearing from Mike, he seemed to be indicating that this formula was new. That it was previously sort of split into these 4 pots, as he was calling them, and divvied up in a different way, and that doing it by this formula would be a new way of approaching the same the categories would change with the formula.
The formula is the same. It's written a little bit differently. In the rule, I thought it was a little complicated how it was spelled out. It talked about allocating 25% to each of the four categories. It's a little more explicit. I think I used the word equally proportionate and proportionate shares. So it's worded a little differently. If we think it's not clear, that's fine. But the formula is supposed to be the same. The one change, though, that I should have pointed out is we did try to create flexibility in that formula, which only that if there was some really compelling reason to deviate somewhat, say one fair was not going to make it, without a little bit of extra funding and the other fairs were all healthy. We did tried to build in some parameters where we could look at the relative importance of the grants and the funding. And we still have to equitably distribute. That's the overlying thing. No matter what, it's equitable. And the purpose of the fairs is to make sure that there's successful fairs throughout every region of the state, not just in one geographic area. But it did build in their ability to deviate from that formula equitably if we felt appropriate, which is discretion you may or may not want to give us. I think it's always wise to be able to address the unforeseen when somebody is really desperate for help. So, but that is a bit of a change.
And that line is that's the relative needs of all applicants, now the distribution of medical funds may best meet the purposes of the program. Let's do that.
Correct. That would be on page 7 in the very last language on the top, it'd be line 2 on page 7. In the secretary's sole discretion, the secretary may consider the additional enumerated factors. So those are ones that are enumerated earlier, and use an alternate method to equitably distribute the available funds. So our intent is we would use the formula, but that was just the opportunity that if something warranted deviating from it, we'd have the ability to do it. Rather than the other way to do that would be in a specific appropriation in the big bill or some other way to ask you to draw different parameters, which we could also do, but that's not with the benefit of the grant applicant and with all the information that we have in the application process, because we get the money first and then distribute it later.
Are the fairs enumerated in the annual appropriation? So yesterday there was a question about what if somebody wanted to create a new fair, and what would that process look like, and that led to sort of what are the existing fairs, and we heard that there were some that were dormant might not be the right word, but maybe not active. Is there somewhere in statute where it's spelled out these are the fairs that are eligible, or how is that determined?
Well, that's a great question. I don't think there's a definition anywhere of fair in statute right now. If you enact this does define fair, and it defines both a fair and an agricultural fair association. You would not need to be a pre-existing. You could open a new fair and be eligible for these grant funds. You would have to be open a minimum of 3 consecutive days each year. You would have to offer at least, I think it's 5 competitive exhibits. You'd have to meet the criteria, but you don't have to be a pre-existing fair to be eligible for this. You could be dormant, come back into fruition. There are fairs now that operate that are not eligible for the stipend because they're not open at least 3 days a year. I don't know how many there are. I think there are 14 that are traditionally registered with us, but to your question, absolutely more fairs could come. If some leave, then there's a little bit more in the pool for those who still are eligible. Sorry, but there's a related note. There's a different program called the Capital Grants, which is in the municipal title. And this is the stipend grant, but there's also municipal grants that go to fairs, but those fairs are also defined as fair. The eligible fairs are also those that are open 3 8-hour consecutive days. So the parameters for entry are the same.
Just sort of, I'll interject process-wise. We won't be making any decisions today.
Sure.
So folks are feeling like I need to get this all figured out today. No, not necessarily. I do see that we have with us today somebody who might also want to speak to the fair issue. And if you feel like that there's something that you'd like to add right now, we can pull up another chair, or we can have you in another time to talk about fairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I am Jackie Folsom. I'm the lobbyist for the Vermont Fairs and Field Days Association. We will be coming in to visit with you on February 2nd, where we will be bringing in several different fairs, some on Zoom, some in person, and telling you about some of the information that Mr. Collier is sharing with you about how many folks are in attendance. We do an economic survey for our fairs. And so we have some of that black and white detail that you may be interested in. I'd be glad to come in and talk to you about our fairs. They are near and dear to my heart, as I hope they will be to you all. But to the point, we have had, I think there are 2 fairs right now that do not qualify for the stipend, and one of them actually is the Vermont Farm Show, because they have not had a show in 5 years, and so they would not be eligible for a stipend because you need to have that piece of it. But all the rest of the fairs really do an outstanding job of using the funds that we provided in the stipend. And I have to say that normally the stipend fund has been $110,000 through the Agency of Agriculture's budget. Last year, there was a little extra money in there, and so Chair Partridge from this committee, former Chair Partridge, added $90,000 to put that stipend up to $200,000 for our fairs this year. And we also received money. We received $1 million thanks to the voting of the legislature through ARPA funds for the year that our fairs were not open and running due to COVID. So the legislature has been very, very generous, and we hope that continues. But we'll be glad to come in and talk about our successes, including the grants, the capital grants, where you might be interested in what it is exactly the fairs do with that pot of money, which is currently at $300,000.
Thank you. Yes.
I have a couple of questions, and one, there was some discussion about the Franklin County site, which is adjacent or abutting or on the grounds of the airport. Does ownership in some entity matter? You know, like the Bonneville Fairgrounds or Tunbridge or Addison. They've been dedicated in the same location for a century or more. Could you rent a plot for a one question?
I think maybe we should limit question just to the witness that we've got, and we'll so if questions that can be answered by others, we'll schedule them for testimony.
And the second piece, 3 consecutive days, do equine horse shows, which equine are considered agriculture in Vermont, used to be a bigger part of the culture in Vermont. Yeah, there were most towns had a 4-H show and that sort of thing. Are they considered, if they're competitive, whether they're morning this?
So
Are they considered a field day or a horse show, a field day?
So to your first question, in the proposed language, an agricultural fair association is defined. So it's a legal entity that hosts an agricultural fair or field day. So ownership is not irrelevant. Renting or owning is not relevant. The question is whether or not you are that legal entity and you host the qualifying event. As for equine events, I do not believe, and Jackie can certainly help, but I don't believe there are any currently, but I think if it met the criteria, it could be eligible. If clearly horses are part of agriculture, if they had the competitive exhibits that are necessary to have a fair and they operated 3 consecutive 8-hour days. In other words, if they meet all the statutory criteria, I think they could be eligible. I'm not aware that any have ever tried to do that. And yeah, sure.
Representative Rice?
There was on page 4, line 3, there was just a question yesterday about why we would continue to reference statute that has been repealed.
That's a great question. The reason for that is because there's one fair that has been traditionally receiving a state stipend and eligible. And it was eligible because it was legally grandfathered in under this old state statutory provision. And so I was just talking to Mr. O'Grady about that in the hall. It doesn't matter to us how that grandfather is accomplished, but because of the strange sort of evolution where the rule is still being used that doesn't have a statutory foundation anymore, it made, I just referenced the state statute that used to be in effect rather than the rule that no longer is. So, but it could be worded, somebody who received one in 1990 when the rule, or it could be someone who was eligible the last 5 years. Any way would be fine for us as long as that fair's protection is continued, as long as that's something that you all want to do.
And then thank you. Separately, getting back to the perhaps hypothetical idea about somebody wanting to start a new fair. It sounds like there's nothing that would bar them from being eligible as they got moving, but maybe they wouldn't be eligible for their first year based on not having held a fair for 3 consecutive days, and so that seems to be a barrier to starting a new fair if you're not eligible for the grant funds to actually get up and running.
It is.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you have to prove some level of success before you're going to be eligible for under the current framework, you're going to have some kind of success, because even if you could apply, all your numbers would be 0. So your proportionate share would be 0. So absolutely, there is that barrier to startup cost, although it's a pretty short-term barrier, because even if you have a poorly attended fair that's open for 3 consecutive days and you meet all the criteria, you'd be eligible pretty quickly. You just wouldn't get a very large share of the funds. But even a small share of funds to a new fair could be incredibly important, I would think. Hypothetically.
Just back to the earlier point about the statute that no longer exists and that reference. Can we know what that event is? That grandfather fair, the 2-day event?
Yeah, it was a Guilford Fair is my understanding. Yeah. And Jackie, is that right? Yeah, thanks.
And it's grandfathered because it's 2 days and not 3.
Yes.
Correct.
All right. Well, why don't we move on then unless there are other questions, we'll move on to the next topic. It's Bill.
So this is on page 7, section 2, be line 7. This is a very simple amendment. It's just updating the word in our meat so we register and license and inspect all establishments that deal with commercial meat in the state. And the word that's currently used for this part of the statute is cutting, which is just an outdated word. It's not comprehensive. It's processing is the appropriate word now. So it's just a language change to make the statute updated. I'm happy to answer any questions, but it's really as simple as that.
Representative Rice?
It's not about the change in word, but it's about a different word.
Okay.
I said yesterday, but as currently written, it seems to say that you would be in the $50 license fee if you had either less than 300 square feet or less than 20 linear feet of display. And then the $100 says 300 or more square feet and 20 or more linear feet of display. So it seems like that should be either, it should be and for both or for both.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And it actually looks like there's a typo, unless this is wrong. It says, specific west or meat. Okay. Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. I don't know that there's any specific reason to do that.
And I think it probably should be or for both. I think the intention is to say if you have either 300 square feet of process of behind the counter or more than 20 feet of counter space, then you should be in that 100.
I agree that I would think that was the intent, was that it would be either one of those things would make you eligible for the fee or the next level fee.
So which line is that, just so we can note it there?
12. On page 7.
Yeah, 12. And or more.
Yeah,
It's
3 or 20.
300 or more square feet of meat.
Sorry,
Yeah, Dave.
sorry to, another nuance here though, is what if you're under 300 square feet but have more than 20 feet of linear display? Doesn't that create a
That's why that change should, that's why it should say.
It's, okay. All right, so that would be effect, I see.
Yeah,
All right.
if the intent is that it's either one of those things makes you eligible, then it should be an or instead of an and. And I suspect that's the case because otherwise it wouldn't really be a need to delineate both. Yeah,
Nice catch.
yes. I'll be more careful.
That's what we like to hear.
Great, well,
Yeah, so one of the things that our agency does, which is pretty fascinating, is we are responsible to ensure that a litany of weights and measuring devices that are at the front of the consumer transaction, meaning they're things that weigh or measure things that consumers are buying. It's our responsibility to make sure that those things are accurate so consumers are getting what they pay for. It goes from everything to deli scales at your local deli, to gas meters at gas pumps, to propane meters on trucks that are dispensing gas or petroleum trucks that are dispensing fuel to your houses. There's just anything that's a commercial scale, that's truck scales, a litany of things that we do that we measure. So all of the people who have those commercial scales have to license with us every year in order so that we know who they are and so that we can inspect them. The way the language is written right now, the statutory language is we are only supposed to give a license to somebody with one of these devices if we have inspected that device within the last 12 months. So given the litany of devices in our staff, that's not possible for us to always have inspected every single device in the state within 12 months. We are not inclined to not give a license to someone because we can't inspect their device. We do routine inspections. We have ways that we check gas pump, all of these things. We do it, but we can't necessarily get to every single device within every 12 months. So the request is to allow us to continue to issue licenses if we've inspected something within 12 months, but also for a longer period of time as we determine appropriate based on the relative need. So it's asking for discretion to prioritize and inspect the things that we have the capacity to do. Obviously, we respond to complaints. Obviously, we're available to address issues, but we just can't physically inspect every single weights or measuring device in the state every 12 months. And Mark Paquette, who's the chief of the program head of that division, he's a wonderful, very interesting person who'd be happy to chat with you if you need, but that's really that's the ask.
yes, Representative Cole.
Those devices that you're thinking about bumping down in terms of there's lesser need to inspect them, is there any data on how, like, variations within their reliability?
That's a question that Mark Paquette would have to answer. I don't know. I have a great deal of confidence in how he runs his program. I don't think he wants to eliminate any. I think he just wants to rely more on sort of a statistical sampling of different devices so that, and then obviously he has an inspection schedule for all the various, some things have a higher potential for fraud than other things. So I think there's a desire to do that, but I don't know whether he has the statistical data, but if you're interested, I can certainly ask him if he does.
Representative Levitt and then Representative Rice.
Yesterday, Mr. O'Grady mentioned that some of the scales don't need, he was talking about truck scales. Like some get calibrated more frequently just by the mechanism of how they work rather than like your deli scale. So what you're saying is just a little bit different. It sounds like to me like you're wanting a little more latitude for everything. Rather than he was just sort of saying some things don't need to be inspected every year because of how they operate. So can you just talk a little more about that?
Well, to me, those are complementary things that
Okay.
if there's less need to inspect something, then there's less reason to do it annually. And I'm sure there are better protections for some types of devices than others. And some, I'm sure, are more likely to be disrupted by use than others, better mechanisms, maybe a more automated way to check. But that's not what we're asking for, the latitude to be able to make those sort of judgments.
And
So-
can I ask a secondary question?
Sure.
Which is, what areas of this do you see the most fraud in? Just out of curiosity.
I don't know that we see a lot of intentional fraud. And Mark Paquette would be the better person. We do see some. I mean, there are clearly people who manipulate scales, but I don't think that's common. I think it's more that they're not compliant because they're out of calibration. I think
Okay.
that's the much more common thing. If it was fraud, I mean, that could get to even criminal
Right.
charges. If it was intentionally somebody trying to steal from someone, then that becomes different. There are examples of that, but I think mostly it's just checking to make sure. And keep in mind with all these programs, the real point of it is to get people to voluntarily comply. Most people want to do the right thing. Some people need a little push. But the idea that if you don't even have the requirements, then it's rampant to, if you have your gas meter pump off a cent, that racks up a lot for somebody. So it's just having that requirement to know somebody's watching and is checking.
Representative Rice?
Yeah, is there somewhere where the different acceptable periods of time between is written out for, so basically the agency's asking for discretion, and that seems fine to me if there is somewhere where these things are laid out, where that discretion's laid out and it's not literally just sort of at the discretion of any given person in Mark's job at any given time. But if you're asking for discretion instead of saying we want it to be 24 months instead of 12 months, I would just want to know that those things are sort of laid out clearly.
So in terms of a legal requirement, this 12 months is the only legal requirement. I'm sure that in Mark's program, he has timeframes that he uses, but I don't know what those are. But there would not be, if you gave us this discretion, then there would not be another mandatory timeline. You could certainly evaluate whether we're doing our work well, and if we're not doing it well, then that would obviously raise some questions. But I understand your point, and if you adopt this language, it would give us the latitude to do. I mean, that's the point, is for us to be able to evaluate what we think requires annual inspection and what we think doesn't. But certainly other timeframes could be utilized instead of that discretion.
I think we'll have Mr. Paquette come in and talk
Yeah.
a little bit more about the range of scales, et cetera, and maybe give us a little more, a little more insight into which might not need to be inspected as often.
I know you will enjoy him. I wish I had as much enthusiasm for both his job and life as he. Should we move to the livestock brands or?
Yeah, does that cover everything in the weights and measures?
That's the only request, was for that discretion on the time frame.
Okay, all right. Yes, let's, unless, other questions? Okay, yeah, let's move on to the livestock brands.
So section 4 on page 8 on the bottom of the page, the livestock brands. This is the idea of the livestock brand is to ensure that it's to be able to monitor unauthorized sales and movement of livestock, and that's something that people have privately done for a long time. Some people have privately done for a long time. We think that the state's program is outdated and not needed because there's a federal law called the Animal Disease Traceability Rule that now requires individual marking of animals during interstate commerce, and we also have a state rule that we require individual animal ID for intrastate commerce. So the point of this branding, we don't believe is necessary anymore because there's already other rules that require it. This does not require anything. The whole point of this particular section is to enable producers to ask to apply to the agency for their own individual brand. And then we're supposed to give them a brand that only they can exclusively use. So it's just an outdated program that before, when we first wrote this request for repeal, there had been 3 requests to utilize the program in the last 10 years. Apparently recently, ironically, of course, there's been some more. I don't know how many, but just because that's Murphy's law. But it really doesn't get used. There's no need for it. There's some arguable animal cruelty overlays that by having this program, arguably the state is sanctioning livestock branding, which anybody can do as long as it's humanely done and it's not violating the criminal protections against inhumane treatment of animals. But the program just seems outdated to us. It doesn't get utilized, and so we'd like to repeal it. If people want to humanely brand their animals, they can still do that, but they don't need to come to the state for an exclusive brand, in our opinion.
Okay, good. And I'm sure that if anybody has strong feelings about repealing this law, we'll hear from them and have a chance to hear from them formally.
Maybe, oh, sorry.
Just a quick question, because you talked about this a little bit yesterday. The RFID and branding, is there an expense to switch from one to the other that might be something that some farmers can't incur? Or have we all moved past that?
I am not certain about this, but I know that we have given grant funding. I think it was federal dollars for those RFID tags. I don't know whether that's an ongoing program or whether the need has been met.
Okay.
But I do know there has been available funding in the past, and we could find out the status. But you're right. That's a great, and that's kind of, we believe an ear tag works really well if you want to be able to individually identify an animal and it's minimal intrusion to the animal, and that's a great way to do it.
Yeah.
Sure.
Acronym check. RFID is
Radio frequency.
Identification.
That.
Glad you two had that.
okay. So I think, are bees the last section, bees and apiaries?
There's a couple at the end. I think they take the next 10 though, the B language.
Okay. So just checking the clock.
Oh, and then we have the nurseries after the bees.
Sorry?
Then the nursery sections after the bees.
Nurseries, yeah. So I'm guessing that we may not have enough time to thoroughly go through the bee section. Although if you were going to say, why don't you speak to it in a way that makes sense, given that we've got about 10 minutes.
Sure.
And if we cover it all, great. But if you feel like you'd like to come back, we'll have you back.
Excellent. So there's a lot of language here. Most of it is housekeeping, like literal technical corrections. So I don't think most of it is particularly relevant. The basic objective is to simplify and clarify some of the provisions that are very hard to interpret. And the important part is the whole point of registering. So whenever bees move into the state, they have to be inspected prior to coming in to make sure they don't have a disease. And it's really important for bees in particular, because bees are not like a cow that necessarily stays in your barn or your paddock or your pasture. They go where they want to go. And so if they are diseased, they can spread that disease to a lot of other apiaries. And so we think this is the point, this is the seminal point of the program, is to make sure that bees that are coming into the state aren't diseased. And we do the same reciprocally. When bees are leaving the state, we will inspect them to make sure they don't have disease and before they go into another state. We also inspect them before a sale in the state, so that bees that are being sold within the state don't have bee disease. That's the overlay, and why some of these corrections matter, I think. And another thing is that bees move a lot because people move their bees to the area where pollination services are required. So a lot of our bees that are summering in Vermont are down south or other places over the winter. So there's a lot of movement of bees. And what we want to do is just clarify this to make sure that the bees that are coming into Vermont have been inspected for disease and that we know where they are and that if they, and that we're inspecting them prior to sale. The other, there's a number of changes in here that are just to make the language gender neutral and more inclusive. Just whenever we go through statutory provision, we like to try to fix that. So there's a lot of his or hers in the prior inspection that we changed to usually to the inspector. Just so that's a number of it. And then there's one change near the end that's just correcting the use of colony and hive. Apiary is the location where the bees, the place where the bees are. Colony is the box or the house where the bees live, plus the bees, plus the honey, plus the combs. That's the colony. And then hive is just the box itself or whatever other container you use to contain the bees. So I can, if you like, I'll flip through quickly and sort of maybe point out which of those are which. On page 9, starting on line 14, we asked to strike this subsection 2. That provision, it's just confusing. It's basically, people have to file an annual report with us about their bees. And this imagines them telling us if they're going to move their bees within 2 weeks and what's going to happen to them. And it's proven to be more confusing than helpful. We don't need it. It creates kind of a potential loophole that just makes things confusing. So we're asking to eliminate it. Moving to line 1 on the top of page 10. This is a similar, we're asking to strike a section that the section that we're asking to strike is a reference to when bees move through the state of Vermont but never stop here. So if you're registered in Vermont and you're bringing in bees, you have to tell us about that. If you're just transporting bees from New Hampshire to New York and going through Vermont, you don't. And so this reference is really not applicable to registered apiaries that are in the state. We're not asking to people who are just transporting bees through interstate commerce to tell us anything. We just don't think this provision applies to registered apiaries in the state. So we're just asking to strike that part. When people are in the state and they're bringing in bees, they should be telling us interstate commerce is something that's different. The next sections on that page are all language clarifications and/or gender neutral improvements. On the next page, page 11, same thing, no substantive changes, just language, gender neutral improvements. Page 12, it looks like all gender neutral improvements and other improvements except for in line, so starting on line 8 on page 12. This, right now, bees are supposed to be inspected by us once every summer season prior to sale. That's a little vague and not as effective as we'd like to be in terms of preventing disease. So we're just asking to change it that within 45 days prior to a sale, you'll have an inspection. So in other words, if you bring your bees in February, we inspect you in March. If you're selling bees in the autumn now, that's not close enough in time to detect whether or not they have a disease. My understanding, which is not perfect, is that I think most of the bees are sold at a particular time of year generally anyway. So I think the 45-day window will encapsulate that, but it's just putting a more specific time frame and also making it clear the inspection needs to be prior to sale, not after the sale. Grace?
There was a question from Representative O'Brien yesterday about whether it should be sale or transfer, whether it should also include, if somebody were giving their colonies to someone else and not necessarily exchanging money, but could potentially have the risk of spreading disease.
It's a good question. I mean, if any sort of sort of like if you're a drug dealer, you don't actually have to be paid. You just have to make the transfer. Are you?
It's not what he was thinking.
Talking about bee dealers here, Steve.
I'm trying to figure out if it's allowed to ask another representative's questions because that's.
I'm asking my own question. I was just referencing yesterday that it was brought up by somebody else. Today, it's my question.
So I think it's a good question. I don't think there's any need that it has to be sale. It could be a transfer. I don't know whether people ever give their bees away or not, but it's a great question and probably something our bee inspector ought to weigh in on just because she knows much better. Yeah.
Representative Love.
Oh, I just have this is just a time question. What if you don't have 40? What if you decide to sell your bees to your neighbor, but you're not going to do it you're not planning 45 days ahead? So what's the loophole for that? Because my neighbor almost sold me all of her bees.
Oh.
No, I know, and then I realized
Hypothetical.
I realized I didn't have the bandwidth for all of her bees, but because she was moving quite suddenly and thought she could take her bees with her, and then the transport fell through. So that gave us literally a 5-day window for someone to buy her bees. So how do you deal with that?
So legally, you can't sell your bees without first an inspection.
Okay.
What you do to do that is contact our bee inspector and she might be able to be there the same day or she might
Okay.
not be able to be there. I think 45 days is a timeline that's there to try to be reasonable. Obviously within 45 days, a bee could catch a disease, but that's just trying to measure practicality with.
So then the flip side of this is if you're going to buy bees, you need to build in a 45-day window from somebody to make sure that they can get inspected before you take possession of them.
Except the responsibility is not on the buyer. I mean,
It's on the seller.
it's on the
Okay.
seller to
Thank you.
do it. Yeah. So.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. Other questions? Let's we probably should wrap it up in like a couple of minutes.
Sure.
Steve here, so,
Can I just flip through the language and see if there's anything else that's substantive? Because I don't see anything on page 13 that's any other than technical changes. Same with page 14.
Section C and D.
I'm sorry, which page are?
Page 14, line 10.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. So on page 15.
Oh, here we go.
We do ask to strike a provision which this enables, the current law allows somebody who's registered in Vermont to move their bees out of state as long as it's not more than 75 miles from their registered location and they bring them back within 30 days. That's convenient, I'm sure, but it also is this loophole that's very difficult for us to administer, to know where the bees are and whether or not they've been inspected. And so that gets back to that threshold question of if you're going to move bees into the state, we think it's better that we know that they actually are disease-free and they've been inspected. So this may be something that causes heartache for beekeepers, I don't know. But we found it to be very difficult to implement and not really meeting the need of trying to ensure that diseased bees aren't coming into the state. Keeping in mind that if we get something like American foul brood in some of our bees, that could spread and kind of wipe out all of our bees. So.
I'm curious about the inspection process and how burdensome it is to people managing apiaries. I mean, is it rapid? Is it expensive? Is it slow? Is there a waiting game?
We have one bee inspector for the entire state. As far as I know, she's out on the road all the time, doing these inspections. There's a registration fee. There are fees to register your apiary. I do not believe there's any fee for her to do the inspection. She also gets the import certificates from other states because in order to bring your bees into the state, you have to get them inspected from another inspector out of the country or the state and we get copies of those. So I haven't heard of any complaints about timeliness. I'm sure there are instances where people wish it would happen faster, but we really try to be incredibly responsive to people. That doesn't mean they always agree with what we say when we're there. But I think we get places pretty quickly.
Based on this not being removed from statute, but if this is removed from statute, I imagine she would have a greater burden on her hands. Because there probably are apiaries that go into, New Hampshire and back again within that period that would be otherwise exempt, but no longer with this removed.
That's a great question, and I don't know,
Yeah.
because she would have to inspect before they leave. My guess is that people might just, I'm not really sure what the business need is for moving between Vermont and New York, as an example is, and my guess is that if you had to go through the inspection process, you might just station your bees in those places a little more permanently instead of moving them back and forth, but that's a guess.
Right.
I don't know for sure, but I think that's a likely outcome. But you're right, it could potentially be, but she's been involved in this process and believes it's an important one.
Okay.
And,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I'm gonna suggest that we stop there. I know I think we're pretty much through the B section. We've got a couple of other sections, and just to be sure that we give them our full attention, we'll ask you to come back.
Would you like me to have Mark Paquette try to schedule it so he comes at the same time, or not? The weights and measures?
Might be helpful. We can have Laura reach out and make sure that we find a time that works, and it might make sense to have you both in, at the same time. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, certainly. And okay, that'd be great. I think the nurseries, the nursery and soil amendment should be pretty quick, but
I would think so, but.
Yeah.
All right, well, good, thank you.